Randy's Dandelions by Bill Peet. A fine lion tamer named Randy Monroe performed for a circus a long time ago, and the 5 big shaggy-maned lions of Randy's were billed in the show as the 5 fancy dandies. But strangely enough, very few people knew what fantastic tricks the 5 lions could do, because they were timid and suffered from cage fright, the same kind of fear that an actor calls stage fright. When the circus began and the big top was packed, and they came out with Randy to put on their act, the lions forgot about doing their stunts with a tent full of people all staring at once. They suddenly froze, couldn't budge from their places, with baffled and terrified looks on their faces. All except Dudley, the bravest of all, who just had enough courage to stand on a ball. So the act was a flop, and the crowd became rude. They all stamped their feet, while they hissed and they booed. One night, Colonel Bowers, the circus's boss, complained to poor Randy. His act was a loss. What you need is a whip, because once they get whacked, those lions will put some life in their act. Oh no, Randy pleaded. I wouldn't dare beat them. They're my very best friends, so I wouldn't mistreat them. Well, we can't sell the lions, growled old Colonel Bowers. Used lions aren't worth much, especially ours. We are stuck with these moth-eaten lions, he said, so we'll hire a new lion tamer instead. Poor Randy began his new job the next day, the biggest of all in the show, in a way. He was handed a ladder along with a broom and set off to work as an elephant groom. He swept all the dust off the elephants' hides, behind their big ears, off their backs at both sides. When the lions came into the big cage that night, they were stopped in their tracks by a horrible sight. A powerful man with a fierce black mustache, wearing a helmet and a fiery red sash. He was armed with a chair and a pistol and whip, a long snaky whip with a sting on the tip. When he cracked his long whip, they were so terrified that they frantically tried to find somewhere to hide. But hiding was useless, the lions discovered. Try as they might, they left some part uncovered. And the cruel cracking whip lashed out through the air, snapping off whiskers and large tufts of hair. At last, they just couldn't stand any more, and in desperation they started to roar. Like a deep rolling rumble of thunder it went, up from the ground to the top of the tent. When they returned to their wagon that night, they were still so upset from their horrible fright that they couldn't stop roaring. They kept on and on, long after the show when the people had gone. That's enough, cried the colonel. Now you'd better be quiet, or I'll soon put you all on a head lettuce diet. And if that doesn't fix you, then I'll tell you what, I'll tie all your tails in a triple square knot. But the worst things the old colonel threatened to do couldn't scare them one bit after what they'd been through. I know, said a clown, what'll stop them, I'll bet. We'll douse them with water. Lions hate to get wet. Let's fill all the buckets and tubs we can find. Then call out the elephants. They'll make them mind. Using their trunks, just like fire hoses, they aimed at the lions right straight at their noses. They drenched them until the poor beasts were half drowned, and for a few minutes there wasn't a sound. Then they soon caught their breaths and started once more to roar even louder than ever before. Let's all go to bed, grumbled old Colonel Bowers. They'll run out of roars in a couple of hours. But, as it so happened, the colonel was wrong. The lions continued to roar all night long, so loud and so deep that it made the ground shake, and kept everyone in the circus awake. But they couldn't keep roaring forever, of course, and little by little the lions grew hoarse, and at 6 a.m. they fell off to sleep on the floor of their cage in a big tousled heap. When the colonel woke up, it was already noon, and 1 o'clock show must be set to go on soon. He couldn't get dressed, there was no time for that, So he rushed from his tent in his nightshirt and hat. "Wake up now," he shouted. "On your feet, every one. The show must go on. There's a lot to be done." Soon all the roustabouts swarmed from their tent, yawning and rubbing their eyes as they went, in a hurry to make up time they had lost, and get the show ready to go at all cost. But all the confusion and rushing about was entirely for nothing, it finally turned out. As the grand procession approached the big top, the elephants suddenly came to a stop. They had fallen asleep right there in their tracks, just as limp and saggy as old gunny sacks. They couldn't go on, and no one could make them. Even the loud circus band couldn't wake them. The camels were always bad-tempered and rude, and a night without sleep hadn't helped their mean mood. They wailed and they moaned and they loudly complained, then sat down on their haunches, and there they remained. The zebras were mulish, they kicked up their heels, and knocked off the fancy gold chariot wheels. The poor clowns were just barely able to wake up and put on their costumes, their noses, and makeup. They were too drowsy to hold up their heads. They finally gave up and flopped down in their beds. It was useless to try and get things underway, so the colonel decided to call it a day. And he went to the big top to do some explaining to the crowd, which at this time had started complaining. "I'm terribly sorry," he said with a yawn. "We're all much too sleepy. The show can't go on. I'll return all your money, yes, every last cent, if you'll meet me outside right in front of the tent." However, before Colonel Bowers retired, he fired the new lion tamer he'd hired, and the frightening fellow walked off in a huff with his whip and his chair and the rest of his stuff. Then he went to the lions and gave each a poke with the end of his cane, and they slowly awoke. "Now look here," he said, "I am not a mean man, so I'll try to be just as fair as I can. You'll get one more chance. If you fail to come through, I'll haul every one of you off to the zoo." And that one more chance was all that they needed, for Randy's 5 lions at last had succeeded in overcoming their case of cage fright, for nothing could frighten them after that night. When they entered the cage, you could tell by their faces they were eager and ready to go through their paces. First Buford went bouncing around the ring with his tail curled up under him, just like a spring. And Sam rode a cycle with only one wheel, while he balanced a ball on his nose like a seal. Dudley hung by his heels from a flying trapeze, where he swung to and fro with the greatest of ease. Dudley and Melvin teamed up in some stunts. They leaped through a hoop, that is both at once. This trick was most often a matter of luck. 2 times out of 3, they ended up stuck. But the routine which called for the most skill was Milt's. He walked about on a tall pair of stilts. To top their performance, the last thing they did was to balance themselves in a grand pyramid, so precise and so very exact that one slip of a paw could upset the whole act, or even a sneeze could cause them to fall, and then down came Randy, lions and all. But in spite of these mishaps, they caused a sensation. The crowd cheered them on with a rousing ovation. When the circus was over, they all went to sleep, with big smiles on their faces, in one shaggy heap, for their fear of big crowds was a thing of the past. Randy's 5 dandy lions were happy at last. The end.